We are back with another interview, and this is one that is very special to me. We have the privilege today of being joined by Gunilla Jonsson and Petersen, the designers of the original KULT game. Welcome.
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello.
Yes, it's really great to have you in this interview. I've been really looking forward to this since we began the podcast, and I started thinking about maybe this being a possibility in the future. So super happy and look forward to learning more about your history with KULT. But before we go there, let's begin with you introducing yourselves. Who are you, and can you talk a little bit about your history in the role-playing hobby?
Well, obviously, we're the creators of KULT, the role-playing game, and the writers of the Black Madonna, which you've been playing so eminently in the podcast.
Such a long time.
My name is Gunilla Jonsson, and I'm 53 years old, and I work in the science fiction bookstore in the old town of Stockholm.
And I am Petersen, Gunilla's husband. I also work at the science fiction bookshop. Together we have been playing and creating role-playing games together since the early 1980s.
Yes, we started out with Dungeons and Dragons in 1981, and we made our first game called Mutant in 1983, a game which has since then reappeared in different guises, most recently as Mutant Year Zero. That was a game heavily influenced by the Dungeons and Dragons sibling Gamma World, a post-apocalyptic game we played in the early 80s.
We also played quite a lot of Traveller, Call of Cthulhu, Rune Quest, and all of the other games that were big at that time.
So, well, yeah, we still play role-playing games, and we played role-playing games for quite a long time.
Since 1981, and still at it.
Wow, that is before I was born, so you have been playing role-playing games longer than I've been alive. That is something. So, when you're not obviously now making KULT or writing books for KULT, what do you play these days?
At the moment, we are playing a Dungeons & Dragons campaign in Ed Greenwood's marvelous Forgotten Realms. It's a setting that we have returned to now and then ever since it was released. And I have game mastered quite a lot of Forgotten Realms campaigns. I've actually forgotten most of them by now.
Yeah, I played most of them. And before that, I ran a Mindjammer campaign. Mindjammer is a science fiction RPG using a variant of the Fate rules. I created a setting inspired by Neil Asher's space opera books for Mindjammer. And we are kind of science fiction fans since a long time back and tend to play quite a lot of sci-fi role-playing games. Eclipse Phase is another favorite.
Well, it's coming a new edition of Eclipse Phase this year. I recommend everybody to buy it and play it. And for this summer we are going to play a Glorantha campaign using the 13th Age rules. Glorantha is also a favorite setting with its tribes and cool mythology and the runes. We've been playing Rune Quest since the mid-80s, so it's been a long way.
Wow, yeah, you're playing a lot of different games. That's very, very interesting, and so cool to see that some of the same games have been sticking around for such a long time as well.
Yeah, they tend to mutate and reappear in new shapes.
Yes, old favorites and new shapes happens all the time.
So let us go back to the KULT project and how that first came to be. How did you get involved, and where did the original ideas come from?
Well, when we started working at KULT, we had recently, I think it was in 1989, published an agent spy thriller game named Shadow Masters, Skuggornas Mästare in Swedish. And the leading RPG publishers in Sweden in those days, Äventyrsspel, asked us if we would be interested in making a modern horror game using the same rules and some concepts from that thriller game. They wanted to branch out from the kiddie games and make a more adult role-playing game inspired by Clive Barker and the horror movies that was in fashion then.
So yes, the idea originally came from Äventyrsspel. We started by reading quite a lot of contemporary horror and watched very, very many horror movies, and our favorite is Stuart Gordon, of course. We also watched Italian knife operas, which at least have the horror stuff within. We looked at all the stuff that was around at that time, comics, novels, movies. So we realized quite fast that we really liked this idea, so we set to work to make our own kind of modern personal horror game.
Yeah, and quite a lot was influenced by music as well, the goth music.
Sisters of Mercy,
yeah,
Cure, and all those wonderful groups.
I remember reading in the Äventyrsspel book that I think the original idea for doing a KULT game came from Nisse Gulliksson, and he had, I believe, a vision that was closer to, I suppose, Hellraiser and a lot more weapons involved than perhaps you came with. What was there two different visions at play there?
Yeah, I think it was a good thing that we and Nisse had different visions. Nisse had this more action-like thriller game approach, and of course it was derived from a thriller game. Shadowmaster was a thriller game, spy game, so...
I think actually it got to be a much better game because we had those very different approaches. We were aiming for a much more Aleister Crowley, the role-playing game, and he wanted an action horror game where people got shot and fell down and rose again from the dead and struck at you. So the end product got to be a hell of a lot better by all this working together. So we needed that input as well.
Yeah, and he needed ours, so it was a good thing.
Yeah, I will definitely agree that I think that the two different visions at play there is really what has made KULT such a unique game with such a unique feeling. We did actually get a comment from one of our Patreons, Johannes Johansson, who said that this idea of an Aleister Crowley, the role-playing game, is something that he would really love to see. So perhaps one day that can be something that you can create.
It's almost already created by White Wolf in Mage the Ascension. That is, to a great degree, an Aleister Crowley role-playing game. A very occult game in a contemporary setting.
Almost more like Aleister Crowley's inspirations. It's more like the 1700s and 1800s occult traditions, the one that actually led up to Aleister Crowley, and the more modern occult traditions, ritual magic, kind of changed quite a lot with Aleister Crowley and the bunch of people around him.
But KULT, of course, is much more of a horror game than that. And the thematic setting, the illusion, the dead god, that makes for more of a horror setting, I think, than in Mage the Ascension.
Definitely. And KULT definitely has nailed down the horror angle in a really great way. Did you ever suspect that KULT would become as big as it ultimately ended up becoming? It's spread across the world, translated into many different languages.
Well, we had an inkling during the development phase when Fredrik Malmberg of Äventyrsspel managed to sell the publishing rights in many languages. And then we figured that, yes, it will probably be published in many languages. And the game became somewhat controversial here in Sweden, mainly because the publisher had used toy stores as an outlet for it, and although it said on the box that it was meant for an older audience, it created controversy, and maybe that also helped spread the word. But we never really anticipated great breakthrough because it was quite a niche game.
Yeah.
I will definitely say, as being someone who played the game around my teens, that the sort of dangerous feeling of it, that it was a little bit forbidden, that was certainly something that was very attractive. Definitely drew me and my friends to the game. So and of course the media criticizing it, that just makes you want to play it even more. So I think maybe that helped it, as you say, become even more successful. Although it was a pity that it ended up causing issues with role-playing games in toy stores.
Yes, it did. I think it could have been used as a sort of PR gimmick without releasing the game in the toy stores, because it didn't have anything to do with children's toys.
Almost the only way to actually release role-playing games in Sweden at that time was through the toy stores.
Yeah.
There wasn't that many specialist stores at all. It would never have worked had they only released it in
it wouldn't.
Game stores.
So it was a totally different market then.
Yes, definitely. The market has changed so much, and I think one of the recent big changes that we've seen is now that we have Kickstarter and you can distribute globally very, very easily. It's really helping role-playing games grow a lot. But those early days were quite challenging from a distribution perspective.
Yeah, Kickstarters has truly kickstarted the role-playing game hobby again.
Yeah, made it possible for people with just some sort of idea to actually make a great game and be able to publish it. It's a very good thing for the business and the hobby.
Yes. Not to derail too much, but I'm very happy that we moved from what we called here in Sweden the role-playing death, with so many of the big, not big, but the bigger companies within the business stopping to release new games. We moved from that, just doesn't feel like it was that long ago, 10 years ago maybe, to this new golden age that we have today, and it's a really exciting time to be a role player. Yes, it's
marvelous with seeing all these new games popping up and being born and transmutating into new games. It's really great.
It is. I should mention that the question about KULT being big globally came from our Patreon, Victor Koch. Then let us move on to the Black Madonna that we have been playing on the podcast. Can you talk a little bit about this campaign, the background for creating it? Where did the ideas come from?
A central concept of KULT, the role-playing game, maybe the central concept, is that God is dead. We start to think about that. When did God actually die, and why? What killed him? We wanted to make that central for the first big campaign of the game, setting the scene, so to speak.
Yeah, and that brought us to the Second World War. We had this idea of God dying in the Second World War, made obsolete by the war, by the horrors of the Holocaust, by the loss of life. And we settled for the siege of Leningrad, a terrifying part of history, as a focal point for the campaign.
But we didn't want to make it a historical scenario. KULT is a contemporary horror game after all. So we decided to use dream travel, flashbacks and other tricks to bring the past together with the present.
And we wanted to make the end of the Cold War, the unraveling, as we wrote the scenario, a part of it. That's why it's partly set in Berlin and in Russia, where the Soviet Union was falling apart as we wrote the scenario. So, and also Berlin was central not only to the Black Madonna but to the whole game. We modeled the idea of Metropolis, the original home of humanity, partly from our wanderings around in Berlin right after the wall fell, when you could walk along streets ending in nowhere, and you had all these bricked up buildings, these almost ruins in the east where they hadn't restored them after the war. It was many cities in one city, and we used that as an inspiration for Metropolis.
Yeah, so history and then the contemporary, obviously, it was right around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. What I think is really exciting about the Black Madonna is how both, obviously, the version that you released then was very timely and it was very much what was happening in the world. But maybe something that is a little bit unexpected is that this new release is coming at a time when we have far-right parties rising up all across Europe, and then there's this Russia connection, and in in the Black Madonna, we had just that. We had far-right extremists working together with Russia. And it's just something that I started reflecting on, that it's really... How could you know? Was it something you saw?
No, I don't think we could know. Or maybe we knew somehow subconsciously. We liked Berlin, and lots of people talked about these stories of, the anarchist movement in the East that had played a big part in the fall of the wall, how they were pitched against these neo-Nazi groups. People were killed and beaten up, and Russia played a part in this, in how they moved their military personnel out, how people in the East reacted to the reunification. It's a story that I think many people saw it then and have seen the threads going into our time. It wasn't impossible to see. It's sad that it has re-emerged in such a nasty way now in our time.
Yeah, we actually believed for some time when the wall fell and the world seemed to be changing, that these goddamn Nazis were gone forever, but now they're here again, sticking their ugly heads up in our world. It's horrifying, more horrifying than any game.
Yes, very much agree with that. One thing that Mikael mentioned in the Äventyrsspel book that I have read around the Black Madonna adventure is that I think the comment you made was that the Black Madonna had too much running around air bases firing weapons. This is something that's interesting because when I have game mastered it, I've very much thought the same thing, that those parts, the air base and the missile base in particular, they stick out a little bit compared to some of the other things in the adventure. Was it a clash of visions here that caused this to happen, or was including these areas a deliberate choice on your part?
No, not really a clash of visions. Actually, more like leftovers from the spy thriller game, Skuggornas Mästare. That was the parent game of KULT. I do wish we had removed some of the more action-filled scenes from the campaign.
And I think it was also partly due to Michael game mastering it with our, at that time, ordinary game group. And we really liked doing commando raids. So he put in a lot of commando raid possibilities for us to make us happy. And maybe that didn't make for a very great story, but we enjoyed playing it at the time.
It is as it is. I guess it all started when we started playing Traveller in the early 80s and had a lot of commando raids.
Yeah.
It just kept on moving into game after that, even Dungeons and Dragons. So it was there in KULT in the first great campaign.
We sort of weeded it out later when campaigns were made more for publishing, and we figured that we can't really fill a horror game with commando raids.
Sadly.
I do enjoy them, I will say. They are a little bit of a guilty pleasure for me too. But yes, you're right. When it comes to linking it with the horror element, it can sometimes be a little bit of a tough sort of match there. But in the adventures that follow, if we look at Taroticum and we look at Fallen Angels, I did get the feeling that the focus on action and violence as a primary solution has been dramatically reduced. And I think you touched on it. This was then a deliberate choice on your part to move more in that direction, yes?
Yeah, we felt that KULT had to stand on its own feet as a horror game and not a thriller spy RPG. And it felt kind of like a waste to build this elaborate magical background and then just use it as a monster shooter. Not to say that shooting monsters can't be fun, but...
Maybe not central in a modern horror game, though. We did playtest the later scenarios in another much less commando raid loving group. I guess that also played a part. And we did want to explore the magical and mythological stories buried in the meta plot of the game.
And that became difficult with too many commander rates.
Indeed.
Yes, and you may know that we are going to be playing Taroticum next as a Patreon exclusive campaign. So very much looking forward to continuing to experience the great content that you have created.
Yeah, more magic in that one, and fewer air bases.
Oh, thank heaven for that.
If we look at what happened around the same time as KULT came out, there was another big role-playing game, I believe, released in the same year, Vampire the Masquerade. Was this game something that influenced KULT in some way? I just noticed things like Archons and Lictors they're a thing in Vampire the Masquerade as well, and we of course have the Children of the Night in KULT. Was there some cross-pollination or inspiration, or was it simply sort of the zeitgeist?
Well, you must remember, Vampire wasn't released when we were working on KULT. So we didn't know anything about that game. We didn't know Mark Hagen. Remember, this was long before the internet. The role-playing culture wasn't one big happy family back then. As far as I can remember, Vampire the Masquerade was released in the summer or maybe fall of 1991. That should put it about half a year after KULT was released.
Maybe, if we remember right. I'm not sure. But, of course, it's no coincidence that they explore similar themes. They are children of the same time, end of Cold War, beginning of a more individualistic, globalized era, connected to futures explored in cyberpunk in the early 80s by William Gibson, Bruce Sterling, influenced by goth culture. So many influences are probably the same for the two games. But I think the Archons and Lictors, I think they're a coincidence. Possibly due to Latin and Old Greek being a more common language in school when we were young.
Yeah, we were actually taught.
I read Latin in school. I don't know if Mark Reinhagen did, but nowadays very few kids do. I'm pretty sure about that.
That is true. It was not an option for me to study Latin. Unfortunately, it would have been very interesting.
And rather useless.
Yes, that is also true. But it does help when you are a game master, or if you're creating role-playing games, then it turns out that it can be useful.
Yeah, and it makes it slightly more easy to learn Italian.
That's also true. So we talked a little bit about the meta plot and the mythos of KULT. And one thing that I see popping up quite often with regards to KULT is the importance of keeping everything a secret. That you're not supposed to know anything about the truth. And I would have game masters leading me through KULT who were like really careful that I didn't accidentally look into the parts of the rule book that I'm not supposed to look into. Like everything needed to be a very closely guarded secret. And I believe even now that Helmgast released the quick start rules for KULT Divinity Lost, there was some people who were a little bit upset that the introduction in there actually spoiled, so to speak, some of the truth. How do you feel about the importance of keeping it a secret and letting it be something that not just the characters discover, but that the players also discover? Is that an important thing?
I actually don't think you should keep the myth a secret. It would just be a one-shot game then. Or a game with a backstory, which is rather complex, plays a very small part. No, I think the mythology is the game, and role-playing is a cooperative effect. How can you build something complex and beautiful if only the game master knows what's going on?
And it's also a story of personal horror. And I think it's very difficult to tell stories of personal horror if you, as a player, is fumbling in the dark. It could make for good surprise effects, but I think it creates more shallow stories. I don't think we could have made the Black Madonna really work without other people than the game master have an inkling of what's going on. We see KULT more as a game of exploration, both of external exploration and exploration of the characters' past and motives and psychology in the spirit of the magical traditions used as inspiration. And we think the game group reach more exciting places to explore if they know something about what's going on.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, and I think you touched on something very important there, Mikael. You mentioned that it would be kind of like a one-shot game if it was all about that the revealing of the secret. Because I will say that most of the KULT adventures I remember playing when I was younger, it did tend to be that way. You tended to be a character that learns that the world isn't what it seems, investigates, and then, the adventure ends in this crescendo of blood, gore, and, Nepharites that are coming to claim the characters. But I can't remember ever moving past that, playing as an enlightened or perhaps even an awakened character that's actually, interacting with the higher powers or exploring Metropolis. Or was this something that you experienced when you designed the game and played it yourselves, or were you much more sort of playing enlightened characters that really explored all the areas of the mythos?
No, we didn't play enlightened, awakened characters, but neither did we play stories that always ended in blood and gore and Nepharites coming from all corners of the room. None of our published adventures really have that storylines. It sort of connects to the previous question. If you try to hold the truth from the players, I think they have a hard time creating anything but the most simple stories. More knowledge give more possibilities in storytelling. So giving everybody access to the background mythos, not necessarily by being more awakened, just by knowing more, gives access to better stories.
Well, about the Awakened, we never intended it, the KULT game, to be some kind of superhero game where the characters become enlightened as gods and destroy their enemies with lightning. If you permanently leave the illusion that is our reality, then in my opinion, you're out of the game. But that doesn't mean that the gaming sessions or the campaign always has to end in blood and terror. You can have long campaigns with focus on how player characters and other persons learn about and try to manipulate the illusion and its guardians.
And I think overall it works best with human antagonists in a sort of normal setting where the real reality is perceived as through the walls of the illusion, not using lictors and Nepharites as very central NPCs, but as more peripheral NPCs. The humans should be central to it. We are the imprisoned monsters. We are the antagonists and the protagonists of the game, as to speak.
One question we've gotten from our Patreon, Per Klingberg here, is related to these awakened characters. If you were to implement an awakened character into a functional storyline within KULT, sort of without leaving it and going to some other game, how would you do that?
I think you would have to deal with the awakened character as you would deal with, say, playing a post-singularity human or a powerful emergent AI in a sci-fi game, or how you would play gods in classic fantasy. I think you would somehow have to use avatars with just a spark of the whole present. Otherwise you lose the awe effect of meeting and being a very complex consciousness. If you say that we are simple consciousnesses and you are now trying to describe something vastly more complicated, then I think you have to downsample it and use different tricks to show that the avatar is just a small shard of the whole. But I think it's more for the game master than for the players. I don't really think it's that enjoyable for a player to play this kind of character.
No, it's best kept for the NPCs, I think. But unless you have a very far out, everything goes campaign, sure, if you want that, do it. Role-playing is supposed to be fun after all. But you really can't have any rules supporting that level of gaming. personally, I would freeform that.
Yeah, I could imagine like a campaign where you could have some awakened characters and some sort of more normal persons, and then you could maybe model the awakened characters on figures like the AIs in Ian Banks' culture space opera books, the minds controlling the vast ships and habitats of his space opera universe. They may be more like the awakened in KULT. So I think taking inspiration from science fiction is maybe the best way to go if you need sort of a way how to play this.
This enormous consciousness that literally can think in so many ways we can't even imagine, and exist in so many ways we can't even imagine. In KULT, every man and woman is a star. It's not just a quote from Aleister Crowley. It is also part of reality. We are stars. We are gods. We are monsters. We are the fallen angels. It's very hard to play something like that while being a human being. I really can't imagine it, how it would be. So, no awakened characters as such, no.
One thing that relates to, of course, the whole awakening process is the mental stability system. And we've gotten a question from our Patreon, Anton Gonzalez, who would like to share your thoughts about the old and the new mental stability systems. He says that he likes the new one more, but he thought that the old one was evocative and suggestive at the same time, albeit slightly impractical.
Yeah, they probably were. The new rules are more intuitive, I think, especially since almost everybody are used to the sanity rules from Call of Cthulhu. And the old rules had more of a magical meaning, only by shedding normality, by letting go of the confinements of the illusion could you hope to break free. So they had a more spiritualistic sense to them.
Well, yes, our old mental balance rules use a much more mystical way of thinking. You actually have to become completely inhuman to be awakened. You had to go so far down in your mental balance you became a monster, or rise so high that you really couldn't live in the world anymore. You couldn't interact with anybody. So yes, the new game's rules are more game-like. What you prefer depends on how you play the game, I suppose.
Yeah, as long as you don't fall into some kind of superhero gaming attitude, I think it's all right, because I don't think KULT really lends itself to that. It loses a certain dimension if you go down that road.
We actually made it almost impossible to go above 50 mental balance and below minus 50 mental balance, quite consciously in our old KULT game. It wasn't, you weren't supposed to go there.
No, and the interaction with the other characters become very difficult if you become too
far out.
Yeah.
All right. Then next up, we have a question from Victor Koch again, and he's asking about the podcast. What do you think about it, and how do you feel like your story has been told? How do you enjoy the show?
Oh yeah, the podcast is great. I really like the way they have taken our partly quite cheesy story, and they made it bigger. They made it more complex. That's actually one of the best things with having worked such a long time with games as we have, to see them being transformed and then born again as something new and totally unexpected.
Yeah, it's great fun listening and seeing how you use our old characters and ideas in a new way and sort of expand on them and make something new and more complex out of it.
Some things we never thought about.
Yeah.
So it's nice, very nice.
Are there any moments that have stood out to you as memorable?
Well, I really liked the later parts of it, where you sort of let go more of the original story and expanded on parts that we didn't think of writing in it, and you also the parts where you seem to have done a lot of research into Russian and historical and also German history at the time that we didn't think of. I think it's in many ways our original campaign is a more shallow experience. You have a lot more sense of historic detail, I think, than we had in our original campaign.
Yes.
I'm very happy to hear that, and hearing that the two of you have enjoyed the show, it means a great deal to me. It's a really unbelievable feeling, honestly, because I've been enjoying your games for such a long time, and then to...
And we really don't remember that much of our original anymore. You have to realize it was 25 years ago.
But we do remember that we didn't research details like that.
Oh yes, there was the internet. You had to actually go to places to be able to research them, or try to find something in the libraries.
I've noticed that when it comes to the naming of characters, for example, that a lot of them are named after authors.
Yeah.
And I guess that's why.
Yeah, that's why we just picked a book and took something in on the back page.
Yeah, you can't use like a German name generator that you can do today, or like go to Wikipedia. That wasn't an option.
No, it wasn't. So that also made Berlin like a good starting point. It's always easier with places you have been.
And we like Berlin.
Yes, and I think we will be seeing a lot about Berlin. We've seen some things in Swedish already with an adventure that you have written that was recently published in the game magazine Phoenix, Seven Sisters. That's also set in Berlin, and I believe your GothCon convention scenario is Night in Berlin, yes?
Yes, Seven Sisters is actually where we thematically go back to this death of God theme from the Black Madonna, where the illusion starts to crumble. It's set in Berlin in February 1945, a very bleak place indeed. And despite that, it's something of a magical gung-ho war scenario. Our original title for it was Inglorious Lictors, so maybe that gives an inkling to what to expect. And it also tied into the KULT novel that will be published this spring. The scenario explains the magical background of a place important in the novel, and a character important to some people in the novel is also present in that scenario.
So, yes, the novel. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Death is Only the Beginning is the title, and it was up on Kickstarter very recently. I was definitely a backer of that.
Our first novel, Death is Only the Beginning, is set in Berlin in our time in the summer of 2017. It will be published in Swedish this spring and in English later this year. It is the first book in a trilogy called Mauerfall about magicians and artists in Berlin. The illusion is growing weak and things are starting to fall apart around them.
And that's partly tied into the scenario. And also a convention scenario will be running in 2 weeks in Gothenburg. So, but the novel isn't some sweeping epic story. It's more of a personal horror tale about a man with few, if any, moral restraints who made some very bad decisions and basically creates a hell for people around him. And there's quite a few excursions to hell in it. We like hell, as people who have played KULT can tell, I think.
And we hope that both all the KULT fans and the horror community as such will like it. We have tried to introduce the KULT mythology in a more slow and accessible way for those unfamiliar with it.
Yeah, it's not altogether easy to use KULT in a novel for people who don't know about KULT. It's quite a complicated backstory, really.
And one has to show, not tell, which is making it even more difficult.
Yeah. So, but the convention scenario you mentioned, Night in Berlin, it's not really tied into the novel. It's more of a here and now scenario about graffiti painters in Berlin getting into awfully bad trouble. It's got some thematic connections to the novel about memory and forgetfulness, but otherwise it's self-contained.
Rather horrifying.
We hope.
We hope.
Yes. And it's so exciting that the two of you are working with KULT again. It's I said the same in the interview with Petter, that this really is a fantastic time to be a fan of KULT, both that you get all these new things and then that the both of you are involved, and it's sort of all of KULT coming back in a way, and that's really a dream for us who have been playing the game for a long time.
Yeah, it's good fun to see, as we talked earlier about how these Kickstarters and the revival of the role-playing game scene have brought all things back, and we didn't really think we would come back to KULT again, not before Helmgast decided to publish and kickstart and publish this new Divinity Lost version, and we hope, of course, that it will be a smash success and everybody will like it.
Oh yes, indeed, that would be great. And we would be happy to make some more scenarios or background boxes or information for it. And then, of course, we will also finish our book trilogy about Mauerfall in Berlin.
Yeah, and we think it's, say, 10 years ago when we talked about it, we didn't think that KULT could that easily be dragged into the here and now and modern world. But as you say,
screaming and kicking all the way, you thought.
Maybe it will work out in the modern time. We think so, and Helmgast has done a great job at revitalizing the rules and making it work in a more present-day setting.
It's much more of a personal horror game now.
Yeah, fewer air bases.
Oh yes, much fewer, I hope.
But then again, if the game becomes really, really successful and you have to put out a lot of material, perhaps there's a possibility to sneak in a box focused on commando raids.
Oh yes, we would love that.
Okay. Well, with that, I would like to give a big thanks to you both, Gunilla and Mikael. You have created, together with Nisse, of course, a game that is had such a big impact on both myself and many others across the world. So a big thank you for creating KULT, and we wish you the best of luck with work and life, and hope that you will continue following the show.
Yes, we will, and thank you for a great show.
Yes, thank you a lot. It was a great show, and I hope you make new shows.
Yeah, the Taroticon show, we're looking forward to that.
Oh yes, and New York Stories, of course.
Many opportunities await in the KULT universe, to be sure. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.